Tony Blundetto's decision to shoot our brother Billy is one of the strangest acts in the entire show.
Your brother Billy, whatever happened there?
All right, then.
Whatever happened there?
The shooting.
Whatever happened there?
God rest his soul, man.
Because the man pulling the trigger understands consequences better than almost anyone else in it. This guy even has an IQ of 158.
You might have let it slip one time. You got an IQ of 158.
She told you that?
Anyway, he's a very smart guy. He's got an IQ of 158.
He studies massage therapy in prison and comes home with an actual legitimate plan. He knows New York will demand his life for this. He knows Tony cannot protect him forever. He knows Phil will never accept a payment, an apology, or a sit-down after watching his younger brother die. And Tony B still goes looking for them anyway. By the time he raises the gun, he has already decided that whatever future remains for him is worth less than getting this revenge. That makes the killing feel like practical suicide, even though Tony B never actually says he wants to die. What you're watching is a man whose attempt at living has collapsed so completely that survival has stopped mattering to him. When Tony B gets out of prison, he genuinely tries harder than most released gangsters in this show ever do. He refuses Tony's first offers, works at Kim's Laundry, studies late at night, and plans an actual massage business. He wants a life where his intelligence produces something clean for once. The problem is that freedom gives him a front row seat to everything he missed. Tony Soprano has the house, the money, the kids, the respect, and the power. Tony B has twin boys he fathered from inside prison, having Tony smuggle something out for him because that was the only way left for him to become a father at all. He comes home to sons who are already teenagers, already embarrassed by him, already strangers in every way that actually matters. He missed every year that would have let them genuinely know each other. A daughter has disappeared from his life completely, and no amount of discipline on the outside is ever going to hand him back a single one of those years. Prison took 17 years from him. Civilian life expects him to come back, work exhausting hours, smile at people who talk down to him, and feel grateful for the opportunity. He can understand that path intellectually. Emotionally, every small humiliation reminds him that men with a fraction of his intelligence spent those exact same years getting rich. The bag of money he finds is what pushes that resentment out into the open. He buys clothes, gambles, stays out late, and starts tasting the life Tony has been quietly offering him the whole time. The discipline the massage business requires starts feeling insulting. When Kim criticizes his work, Tony B beats him and destroys the partnership he had spent months building. That scene tells you everything about Billy long before Billy ever dies. Tony B can plan patiently for a long time, right up until shame becomes unbearable. Once that shame reaches him, his intelligence stops protecting him and starts serving his anger instead. Going back to the mob feels like relief. Tony gives him the casino, money starts coming easily, and people finally treat him according to the reputation he carried before prison. But this return creates a different problem underneath it. Tony B is stuck between gratitude and resentment toward his own cousin. Tony Soprano keeps helping him partly because he loves him, and partly because he still feels guilty about missing the hijacking that sent Tony B away in the first place. Tony B can sense that guilt sitting underneath every gift, and every gift confirms the same thing to him. Tony lived the life they were supposed to share, and he paid the full price for it completely alone. His involvement in the Joey Peeps hit proves he has already stopped thinking like someone protecting a second chance. Rusty and Angelo approach him during the Lupertazzi succession conflict, and he accepts the job without asking Tony first, kills Joey, and drags New Jersey straight into a New York power struggle that has nothing to do with him. Money matters here, and so does his impatience about his position, but Angelo matters more than either of those things. Angelo is one of the few people who actually belongs to Tony B's missing years. They shared prison together, jokes, routines, and the strange intimacy that gets created when men age together behind the same walls for a decade. Tony Soprano remembers the young cousin who went away. Angelo knows the man who actually survived being away. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Being as smart as Tony B means seeing through almost everyone around him, which is its own quiet kind of lonely. Tony loves him, but still mostly sees the boy who went away, not the man who came back. Kim sees an ex-con he has to keep half an eye on. Even Kelly and the twins mostly see a stranger trying to buy his way back into a family he was never really part of to begin with. Angelo is the last person left who actually watched him survive something, and who never once needed him to be anyone other than exactly who he'd become. When Phil and Billy kill Angelo, they destroy the strongest connection Tony B has to the person he actually became in prison. Tony understands immediately what could happen next and starts calling him, because he knows exactly what that Soprano temper looks like once it gets triggered. But Tony B is already moving. He finds the Leotardo brothers, wounds Phil, and kills Billy. Calling this stupidity misses the darker truth sitting underneath it. Tony B knows this is suicidal. He simply reaches a point where knowing that no longer controls what he does next. Revenge gives his grief somewhere to go. It also lets him finally stop pretending his future can still be repaired. The massage business is gone. His clean identity is gone. New York probably already suspects him in the Peeps murder. His relationship with Tony is poisoned by secrecy and guilt on both sides. Angelo is dead. Killing Billy becomes one final decision that belongs completely to him. Even while he understands the decision guarantees his own destruction, the attack also exposes exactly where his intelligence stops working for him. Tony B can recognize systems, motives, and risk with total clarity, but he cannot govern the emotions that decide when any of that actually matters. The show keeps making the same point with different characters. Smart criminals rarely escape because they can explain the trap they're standing in. They use that intelligence to walk deeper into it instead. Tony B probably imagines that killing Phil as well would leave enough confusion about the shooter to satisfy the need for revenge and muddy the trail. Phil survives, which makes him the worst possible witness imaginable. From
He's never gonna give up that fucking animal blundetto.
that moment forward, Tony B's death is just waiting for a location. It ends up being his Uncle Pat's farm. A quiet stretch of land that has nothing to do with any of this, no message being sent, no business getting settled, just open space and family history. And it's Tony who does it himself. The cousin he loved and resented, in equal measure his whole life. The one person whose approval and protection he never really stopped needing even after everything. The same guy who wanted grapes, clean hands, and something honest to leave behind, dies on a farm at the hands of the one relationship he could never actually walk away from. That's the detail that stays with me the most. Now, what would happen if Tony B heard about Angelo, felt the exact same rage, and instead chose to stay home? Billy stays alive. Phil never receives the wound that turns him into New Jersey's personal enemy for the rest of the show. Tony B is still guilty of the Joey Peeps hit, but the political situation around that murder actually gives everyone room to manage it. Peeps was killed during an internal New York war on behalf of Little Carmine's supporters. Johnny Sack has every reason to want the people responsible punished, but he also wants the succession conflict to end, and Angelo's murder already helps achieve that on its own. Little Carmine withdraws, Johnny becomes the unquestioned boss, and continued revenge starts becoming less useful to anyone. Tony Soprano would still deny knowing who killed Peeps. He had already figured out Tony B's involvement and quietly decided to protect him. Johnny might suspect the truth, and Phil would push for retaliation, but their actual leverage would be much weaker without a body attached to it. There is no dead brother lying in the street. There is no surviving Phil out there describing the attack to anyone who'll listen. There is no demand that Tony hand over his own cousin for torture. A financial settlement, a warning, or just quiet distance all become genuinely possible outcomes here. Tony B probably keeps the casino and rises fairly quickly. He is useful, calm in conversation, and capable of understanding business in a way that goes beyond street-level collections. Tony trusts him in a way he can never fully trust Christopher, and that creates its own serious problem underneath the surface. Christopher already resents the casino and believes Tony B gets rewarded purely through family favoritism. With Tony B alive, earning well, and standing beside Tony during real decisions, Christopher's jealousy only grows from there. Tony B could genuinely become the reliable successor Tony once hoped Christopher would be, and that alone could push Christopher further toward drugs, resentment, and the reckless behavior that eventually gets him killed anyway. Tony B would also give New Jersey another genuinely capable man during its later decline. By the final season, Tony's leadership group has become dangerously thin. Silvio gets shot, Bobby gets killed, Christopher is dead, Carlo becomes an informant, and Paulie is aging into fear and superstition. Tony B surviving season 5 changes that entire balance. He could serve as a captain, an advisor, or even a bridge to New York because of his history with Angelo and the other people over there. When war eventually threatens everything, Tony finally has someone intelligent enough to see it coming. The bigger question is whether the war still happens at all. Phil's hostility toward Tony actually predates Billy entirely. Their first real conflict starts over money, when Phil avoids paying what he owes and Tony has to chase him down to force the issue. Phil already sees New Jersey as a lesser organization before any of this. He spent 20 years in prison and comes back completely obsessed with standards, sacrifice, rank, and respect.
You want compromise? How's this? 20 years in the can. I wanted Manicotti.
I did 20 fucking years.
20 years inside. Not a fucking peep.
I did 20 fucking years.
20 years in the can.
I'm not very sure, but I think he did 20 years in the can. Anyways, back to what I was saying. Tony bends rules, protects relatives, earns through unconventional schemes, and talks to New York with the confidence of an equal rather than a subordinate. Every single part of how Tony runs things irritates Phil on a personal level. Billy's murder gives all of that resentment a permanent emotional center to orbit around. Phil can tolerate business compromises for a while, especially under Johnny Sack, but every interaction with Tony keeps pulling him back to the same injury. Tony protects Tony B, kills him himself before Phil can get his own revenge, delays action against Vito, and keeps behaving as if Phil's pain is just something that can be managed through procedure and patience. Phil experiences every single one of those decisions as another humiliation connected straight back to Billy. Without Billy's death, Phil still dislikes Tony plenty, but hatred alone doesn't guarantee a war. Mob wars cost real money, expose leadership, attract law enforcement, and force captains to risk their actual lives. A boss needs an argument other men will accept before they'll follow him into that. Billy gives Phil that argument on a silver plate. He can frame Tony's entire family as undisciplined, disrespectful, and willing to shelter direct attacks on New York. His private grief becomes organizational policy almost overnight. The later conflicts could still provide another opening for him, to be fair. Vito's sexuality and Tony's hesitation to deal with it infuriate Phil regardless. Fat Dom disappears after provoking Carlo and Silvio. Tony brutally attacks Coco for insulting Meadow and later points a gun at Butchie. The asbestos dispute turns openly hostile on its own. Each of these events adds real pressure in a timeline without Billy, but only if the same people hold the same positions and make the exact same choices. And even then, what each event actually means changes completely. Vito becomes a conflict over honor and authority. Coco becomes a conflict over an unauthorized attack on a made man. Asbestos stays a fight purely about money. All three of these disputes can actually be settled, because both sides gain something real by settling them. Billy cannot be settled or restored in any version of this. Phil's grief has no price attached to it, which is exactly why every later compromise starts to feel temporary the moment Billy is the reason underneath it. Phil may still go looking for another reason within a year of becoming boss regardless. His personality demands enemies, and his prison sentence leaves him permanently furious at every man who got to enjoy the years he lost. Tony remains the easiest target he has. But Phil's own crew would have far less patience for a total war built purely on wounded pride with no body behind it. Butchie supports the attack on New Jersey in the actual show, then turns against Phil once the war becomes too costly, and Phil refuses to sit down and talk. Without Billy, that hesitation from Butchie almost certainly arrives earlier. Phil could still order pressure, beatings, lost business, or even a single targeted killing. Decapitating the entire Soprano leadership all at once becomes a much harder thing to justify to the men who'd have to carry it out. There is also a real chance Johnny Sack prevents things from reaching that point at all. Johnny understands Tony, values what New Jersey earns for everyone, and can control Phil for as long as he remains boss himself. His arrest still removes that protection eventually, and his death still opens up the exact leadership struggle that brings Phil to power either way. But even so, Tony and Phil would enter that period without a blood debt sitting between them. Their hospital reconciliation might actually carry some real weight for once. Little Carmine could mediate without having to speak directly into a wound that never closes. The peace here would still be ugly for everyone involved. Phil would insult New Jersey, Tony would retaliate, and both sides would keep fighting over percentages the way they always do. The final season could still produce real violence. What changes is the engine underneath it, shifting from revenge to plain competition. That distinction actually matters because competition invites calculation. Revenge makes loss feel acceptable in a way calculation never does. The most likely outcome here is a delayed, smaller conflict rather than the war we actually got. Phil still becomes dangerous eventually. Tony still creates enemies through his own pride and impulse control. Coco or the asbestos dispute could easily become the spark instead of Billy. But the response would probably focus on Tony himself, or one specific earner rather than the whole structure. The coordinated attempt to kill Tony, Silvio, and Bobby together grows specifically from Phil's belief that the entire organization is rotten, and that Tony's leadership has repeatedly denied him justice for years. Billy's death is what lets him keep believing that story without ever having to question it. Tony B's survival might even help prevent the war through simple strength. A healthier New Jersey leadership group gives Phil far less confidence that he can remove the top three men and just absorb what's left of the business. Tony B understands New York's internal politics well enough that he could notice Butchie's doubts earlier than anyone else does. Of course, he could also make everything worse by accepting another secret contract, acting on some other humiliation, or challenging Christopher directly for a bigger piece. Keeping him alive removes one catastrophe, while keeping the exact man capable of creating a completely different one. That uncertainty belongs entirely to Tony B himself. He is too intelligent to write off as simply reckless, and too unstable to become the perfect advisor Tony actually needs. His whole future would depend on whether the Billy decision was one isolated collapse or the clearest possible expression of who he really is underneath everything. The evidence leans toward his anger coming back eventually. A man who destroys his own legitimate business over one confrontation and then secretly walks into a New York war has already shown you the pattern. Staying home after Angelo's death would have to be the first time in his life he actually breaks it. If Tony B never kills Billy, Phil loses the one grievance that turns every disagreement into unfinished family business. New York and New Jersey might still collide anyway, because Tony and Phil are both proud, violent men competing over money and authority. But the collision loses its certainty, its scale, and most importantly, its emotional fuel. Billy was the death Phil carried into every single room he walked into. Without that body behind him, Phil actually has to go convince people that a war is worth the money. Tony B also gets to keep the future he came so close to reaching. He stays alive, valuable, and permanently one decision away from another mistake. The smartest man in the room finally has to prove that intelligence can stop his own hand before anger gets there first. One quiet choice, going home instead of hunting the Leotardos, could have saved his life, strengthened Tony's family, and left the final war searching for a reason strong enough to even begin.